Welcome to the Wild Wild West, where you have heroes and you have villains. But what happens when your heroes become villains? My name is Dan Finley, and this is The Story Grind, a show where we take a look at storytelling so we can become better storytellers. On today's episode, we're taking a look at the very first issue of The Blood Brothers Mother from Distillery Comics. Story Grind is brought to you by the stories that I make. If you want to follow along on my story writing journey, subscribe to the monthly newsletter where I give monthly updates. Links to both are in the description below. If you really like the show, please like, follow, and subscribe and share with your friends. Your support means a lot. So, The Blood Brothers Mother came out in 2024 and is 45 pages long. It is in a more prestigious, more magazine-size format instead of your regular comic book format. Which means the images are going to be a little bit larger, a little bit more rectangular. Here's the creative team behind it. Now we have a few names that you might recognize, including Brian Azzarello and Eduardo Rizzo. Both of these guys worked on a comic called 100 Bullets way back in the day. That was originally released in 1999, and that's sort of where I know their work from. I wasn't a huge 100 Bullets fan, but I was a huge Eduardo Rizzo fan, and I have some of his older black and white stuff, and he is such a masterclass in black and white comic art that maybe I'll do an episode on that on its own someday, because his stuff is just so good. It's iconic in a lot of ways. So, but let's stick with the Blood Brothers Mother, where he is doing not just the drawing, but the coloring and painting as well, and you get to see his full work on display here. All right, here we go. Scene 1, 4 pages long. Page 1. We open up on this shot introducing a character. First we see his boots, and we get the narration of Before My Story. Next shot is of his hands in handcuffs, and the third shot is on a very tight close-up of his eyes, showing some scars underneath those eyes. What we have here is like very rectangular, almost cinematic. It's almost like the camera is panning up from the feet up into the eyes. And this won't be the last time I say that this comic is very cinematic, especially these first few pages. I almost wish there was a video out there that talked about character introductions in comics. This is a really nice one. I think there are some videos out there that talk about character introductions in cinema, but I've never seen one in comics, so this would be a really interesting video. Maybe sometime in the future I'll do one. But this is a great intro, right? Feet first, and then just a pan up to the eyes of the character. Okay, page 2. We get a shot of some mean-looking guys wearing prison stripes, and then we get a medium shot of our main character again. The narration continues, was his. So Before My Story was his. A man holds a gun to the main character's back. Let's call this guy with the gun the warden. And he says he thought the prisoner would die in this place. Okay, page 3. We get a nice low shot where the warden says he even bet on our main character dying in prison. Is this foreshadowing? Maybe. Panel 2 shows our main character in the foreground. Those mean-looking characters are in the background staring him down. And the main character says, "There's still time." I really like these visuals because I feel like there's a story here, and it's told strictly through the visuals. I kind of think of it as like the main characters had several encounters with these guys in prison, and they're pissed that he's getting out. It also shows that he's outnumbered, and the message to me is that this guy has to be pretty tough to survive all of these guys. I mean, they're pretty mean-looking guys, so... and he seems to be pretty nonchalant. Page 4, we break out of the cinematic grid with the warden saying, "It opens." Is that intentional? I don't know. But the warden says, "I have this feeling we'll meet again." This is actually our inciting incident. It's not a big, bombastic inciting incident, but it is taking the main character's life and setting him free from prison and putting him back out into the world, right? His ordinary world was just being caged, and now he's free again. What are his objectives that will drive this story? Well, we're about to find out. Okay, let's get into scene 2, 5 pages long. Page 5. So our main character is released from the prison and meets up with his old posse. A character named Levi hands him his guns. When Levi asks what happened to his face, he answers 5 years in a Mexican prison. Now, I assumed that he was in a Mexican prison based on the visuals, but this helps reaffirm it. I think this will be the start of a strange phenomenon in this comic where the writer delivers the information in an elegant way and maybe in a visual way, and then kind of undercuts that elegance by having a character say the exact same thing out loud. And I think this is an interesting technique. I don't necessarily think it's bad because I've had some talks with writers in television who have kind of been in the same situation where you, on one end of the spectrum, you have sort of like that era of the Mad Men TV show where everything was really understated, everything is super subtle, nothing was explained outright. And then you have the other end of the spectrum, which is like maybe Law and Order SVU, where after the commercial break, you have a character who like kind of recaps everything for you just in case you missed it. Some people really love this style of storytelling. Some people really hate it. Some people think it just sort of appeals to the lowest common denominator for the people who don't get it. It's kind of up to your personal taste. I don't mind it so much. I would have loved to have not seen it in this because I think I would have gotten it, but for the other reader who might be speeding through a stack of comics this day, they might not get it, and they need that reaffirmation to let them know what's going on. But ultimately, as a writer, it's up to you and your style choices, right? On to page 6. The main character wants to know where his gang has been for the past 5 years that he's been in prison. We finally hear the main character's name for the first time, which is Carter. Levi says that he and Billy Roy were in prison for trying to rob a bank so they could get money and pay a bribe to rescue Carter. Notice how they say they needed to bribe the guards. Carter isn't an innocent man who's wrongly been jailed for robbing a bank. He's robbed a bank and then got caught. I think this is a very interesting character insight. And like a lot of sort of Western stories, you're going to see these characters that aren't necessarily perfectly good and aren't perfectly bad. And I think this story in particular really highlights sort of the flaws of certain people. And we're going to get some more insight into that a little bit later. So the next thing Carter says is Anna with a question mark. So we go into page 7. Billy Roy says, "Pay up, Elmer." This is the second time someone has made a bet against our main character, just as a side note. I don't know if that's going to be a running theme throughout the story, but I mean, we're only, 7 pages in and we've had 2 people bet against him? It might be interesting to see how that plays out. So far we have 4 names. Our main character, Carter, the man he's talked to first, and I think we can assume they're old colleagues of the bunch, Levi, Billy Roy, who did time with Levi to help free Carter. So I think they're close. Then there's the old man Elmer, who just lost a bet. Billy Roy had made a bet with Elmer that Carter would ask about Anna, a character we haven't met yet. And this is a really great way to show how important Anna is to Carter. Carter does say, "She's the reason I'm getting in the saddle, Billy Roy." And then here we go, another situation where we didn't really need to hear this part. But again, if you're reading fast, you didn't notice that Anna was really important to Carter, and this sort of hits the nail on the head right at the end. Again, I kind of wish it wasn't there because I got it, but to each their own, right? Carter wants to know where Anna is at, and they tell him he's not going to like it because she's married. All right, page 8. We move into some traveling shots. We're back into sort of the cinematic format again, and we get this narration, which is almost a kind of an interlude as they're traveling through this sort of desert, yellow bleached landscape. Just a side note, I really despise the text used for this narration. It's supposed to mimic handwritten cursive, but I'm not sure if it's because I'm old or the font is too small, but I'm having a really hard time reading it. We still don't know who the narrator is, but they tell us they didn't really know or even have a good memory of their father, who is the Carter character we've been following so far. Okay, page 9. I think we're starting to see that the art takes a shift here, as the artist starts to bring purples in to illustrate darkness. It's kind of strange because An artist will usually paint all in one style, but bringing in a more colorful way of illustrating darkness 9 pages into the book feels like a bold choice. If you look at the rest of the page, he doesn't really commit to it yet either. I'm not sure what's going on here, but I would love to hear the artist's reasons behind this. I mean, Eduardo Rizzo is an incredibly talented artist, so I don't think this is being done by mistake by any means. But I do think it's a strange choice, and I don't know, is he experimenting with watercolors? Is he trying something new? Or is this a very distinctive choice? I'm still not sure, but as we move into the book, we're going to see much more colorful interpretations of night. So Carter asks Levi about the older guy, Elmer. Levi says he's a good hand. There's a few others waiting back at camp as well. Elmer says, "So you owe us. Couple more jobs ought to settle it up. Free to cut loose then, or if you're happy with the arrangement." I'm assuming he's going to say that they can keep working together. The scene ends with a gunshot off panel and the gang race back to the camp. All right, scene 3, 8 pages long. Page 10. The gang arrives at the camp and finds out that those who stayed behind encountered some homesteaders and invited them to share the fire with some malicious intent. We see that these guys are drinking and that there's a dead dog, which is a pretty ominous visual. Page 11. One of the thugs introduces himself to Carter, but Carter ignores him and snags the bottle out of his hand and starts drinking from it. The thugs suggest that Carter goes to the back of the wagon. Page 12, there's sobbing off screen. We see a few dead homesteaders, tossed luggage, and a dead dog. So if you're familiar with Save the Cat, the concept is that your character saves a cat or does a good deed to show that they're a good person to the audience. It's kind of gimmicky type of technique in my opinion. But I think you can also say the opposite is true if the person hurts a cat or hurts a dog. They're immediately shown as a villain. So we see some dead homesteaders and a dead dog in this scene, and we know that those guys who stayed back at the camp are not really great people. Now, I kind of feel like there are more elegant ways of revealing character. And the great thing is we're about to see one in the next few pages. Okay, page 13. So I'm actually not going to show this page because it's pretty gratuitous. And if any kids are watching, I don't want them to be exposed to this. But this is definitely one of those moments that are not for the faint of heart. So one of the ways the creative team shows this is by having Carter go to the back of the wagon and discovers what happened to the female homesteaders. It's pretty gratuitous, so I'm not going to show it here, but 2 women have been brutalized and one of them is still alive. The other has been stabbed with a knife. Pretty horrific stuff. Page 14, Carter climbs to the back of the wagon, takes a drink from his bottle, and pulls a knife from the dead woman. So now we're confronted with a character question. What will our main character do? Is he really a bad guy or is he a hero? I think it would have been great to let this page land on a page turn, because when you look at it in the actual book, it's the facing page and it kind of gives it away because you can kind of glance over and see it. If this would have been on a page turn, there would be a little bit more suspense as you go, oh man, what's he going to do? Is he going to, join in the debauchery, or is he going to defend these women against his newfound rescuers? So, page 15, we cut back to the campfire with the others. Someone says, "Your brother," and this is the first time hearing that one of them is related to Carter. So I'm guessing it's Levi since he's the first one he talked to. I want to make a side note here. I am having a hard time discerning who is who in this comic so far. I know Elmer's old, Billy Roy has a bowler hat on, Levi is blonde. There's another white-haired guy named Dale who was one of the ones who stayed back at camp. It's kind of confusing for me, but maybe the characters don't matter at this point. One of the outlaws is shot through the eye suddenly. The gang jumps to attention, but another one is gunned down. Dale draws his gun. Okay, page 16, Dale is shot. Funny thing is that everyone behind him, while Levi and Billy Roy, are pretty calm. Elmer seems to be a little concerned, though. All right, so now we see that Carter stands with his guns out. He's the one doing the shooting. So our character moment has finally come to fruition. He may be an outlaw, he may have robbed banks, he may have been in a Mexican prison, but ultimately, when push comes to shove, he is a good guy. This is a character choice, which I like so much better than a save the cat moment. I mean, a save the cat moment is someone is kind to a cat, someone is kind to a homeless man, someone makes an offering, and and that's supposed to show that they are a good person. But I think it is so much stronger when you have a character confronted with a fork in the road and they have to either go left or go right, or do the right thing or do a bad thing. And like in this situation, we have Carter choose a more righteous path by killing the guys who brutally assaulted these homesteaders. It's a much stronger choice. It's a much stronger way of showing character, and I always prefer it. But of course, this is writing, and to each their own. Now, it's still kind of a toss up to me whether this is a point of empathy. I mean, I kind of like the choice that he's made, but I'm not necessarily empathizing with him. So I don't really have a point of empathy for him yet. So Elmer stares down the barrel of the gun and says, "Didn't like the arrangement then?" and is killed by Carter, all while Levi is pouring himself a cup of coffee. Now I thought this is strange because Elmer wasn't in the camp with the guys who assaulted the homesteaders. Elmer actually was referred to by Levi as a good guy. So the fact that Carter's kind of killed him, it's not a huge stray for the character, but I feel like this is going to be some really interesting insight into his character. Sure, he's defended the homesteaders, and Elmer, who was not a part of assaulting the homesteaders, still gets killed just for being friends with them. I'm not quite sure. It almost seems like Elmer's kind of like an innocent to a degree in this whole situation, but he's still killed. And it brings me into a little bit of conflict with Carter. Not too much because they're all kind of bad guys. But I think this is a really tiny peek into what we're going to see in Carter's character a little bit later. So yeah, ultimately we didn't need to know anybody's name because they're all pretty much dead except for Levi, Billy Roy, and Carter, the guy who's been released from prison. Okay, on to page 17. Carter wants to leave the dead outlaws for the coyotes and bury the homesteaders and burn everything else. Carter takes off, and when he's asked where he's going, he says he's got a score to settle. Scene 4, 2 pages. Page 18. We get a continuation of Carter and Levi's conversation over silent panels of a different scene. Carter asks Levi if Anna is married for certain, and Levi says, yeah. The visuals show a small town. The warden from the prison is finishing up some business with a prostitute and puts some money down. Page 19. The warden leaves the house and discovers a drawing stabbed into the door frame. We see his reaction to the drawing, and then he's shot through the forehead. The drawing has a message underneath. It says, it's a message from Carter, and it says, I ain't your amigo. So over these visuals, the conversation continues between Levi and Carter. Carter asks what kind of man would marry Anna when she has 3 bastard children. Levi answers that the man is, scene 5, 4 pages, page 20. The dialogue finishes with Levi saying he's a man of God. And we get this shot of a crucifix kind of from very, very low angle looking up into the sky. Now we're in a different town, nestled in a forest in a one-room church with a cabin in the distance. I really like the layers of depth happening here. The artist is doing a great job of like establishing foreground, midground, and background. Really great way of establishing depth in a 2D plane. Page 21, we get our first shot of the Reverend that married Anna. Very stern-looking guy, very serious-looking Reverend, and bright red hair. That'll actually come into play in issue 2, but we won't really talk about it in this issue. We also get a shot of Anna and her three kids for the first time. Now, I think there's something to be said of characters who are talked about before they are introduced. I think that could be like a whole other video because when you are talking about a character that hasn't been introduced yet, you are bringing an importance to that. I think one of the best stories to kind of pull this off is a movie called Sexy Beast, directed by Jonathan Glazer. Um, and I think the first half of the film, they're talking essentially about Kingsley's character in it. And it builds up so much tension that when he finally shows up, it's amazing. Highly, probably one of my favorite films of all time. Sexy Beast, definitely worth checking out. So we get a shot of Anna and her three kids for the first time. The Reverend is preaching about vengeance and how they should turn the other cheek. Page 22. This page focuses on Anna, now named Mary, and her kids, and it's revealed that the narrator is one of the children. I'm still not sure at this point which one it is, though. Maybe the youngest? So the narrator tells us that the Reverend is named John Blood and talks about how they met. Anna's family abandoned her and her kids, and she was alone, but the Reverend took them in. Visually, the middle child is holding a frog during the service, and it is crushed by the older brother. Pretty gross. Page 23. The visuals show a dog licking the middle brother's hand, which is covered in green goo from, I'm guessing, the dead frog. It also shows people leaving the church after the service, and John Blood and his family are returning home to that cabin that was in the background in the original opening shot of this scene. The narration continues saying that John Blood took the boys as his ward, and they moved west where a community needed a reverend. Scene 6, 3 pages. Page 24. The family eats dinner, and I gotta say, this reverend looks really mean. I mean, I'm kind of worried for these kids. The vibe is abusive husband / stepfather for some reason. Maybe it's the red hair and the scowl. I don't know. John Blood says he is proud of the sermon he did, and essentially, the Reverend calls out his stepson for having a frog during service. I just want to point out that I really like this last panel on the page where the character in the foreground is colored in a monochromatic purple. For some reason, it's evoking this sort of European comic style from something like heavy metal for me. All right, page 25. The Reverend presses his kid on if he understood the sermon, and the older child answers, giving us a theme for the story. Page 26, the older child says, "Bad parts of our lives won't make us bad, long as we trust in God to be bad for us." So that's interesting. It's an interesting thought. And as we continue to read, and I think as you read future issues, I think it's going to be important to sort of apply that to the characters that we meet. As the child speaks, one of the brothers sees people coming towards the house in the middle of the night. So I'm going to end this scene here because the next scene takes on a different tone. All right, here we go. Scene 7, 6 pages. Page 27. John Blood greets Carter and his gang outside the house. Anna also steps out. Page 28. Carter and his gang stay on their horses, and they look very serious. Carter says, "You look good, Anna." Anna says she never expected to see Carter again. And then there's a shot of the kids watching through the window, and then a shot of the rifles in the house mounted on the wall. So we're getting sort of a visual setup to some visual tension that's currently happening. Page 29. The eldest son comes running out with a rifle, screaming "Pa," and trips over an upturned plank on the doorsill. He falls to the ground, and Carter and his gang immediately draw their guns. Page 30. John Blood holds his hands up and steps in front of the kid, attempting to de-escalate the situation. Carter asks if the kid is his, and Anna says, "There's no one child belongs to any of you." So she's speaking to all three of them. Carter says that that's fine because they're only here for Anna. Okay, page 31. John Blood says that his wife isn't going anywhere. Carter doesn't seem to be interested in hearing no and tells Anna to say goodbye. She doesn't budge though. Carter says he'll be back in 3 days. So now we're entering the reason why I wanted to take a look at this book. So this is interesting. So at this point, the Reverend, who's only had like a scowl and this sort of red hair and maybe sort of a sour attitude, doesn't appear to be a great guy. I do like Carter better, and the idea that Carter's going to take someone against their will is leaving me conflicted. He's shown himself to be a good guy. What he's doing now is not good though. So now I'm wondering how this whole thing is going to turn out. So I'm conflicted in that the Reverend doesn't appear to be a great guy. I mean, he's very much like he's looked mean. He's got the red hair. He seems to be a little too strict and stern towards his stepkids, but he hasn't really done anything bad necessarily, right? He hasn't done anything bad as far as a character choice. It's just more of like my response to just seeing him visually. On the other side, you have Carter, who's sort of a bad guy, but he's sort of defended those homesteaders who were savagely beaten and abused by those thugs at the campfire. And now we have a confrontation where Carter is kind of kidnapping maybe an ex-girlfriend. It's kind of hard to say, but it's strange because now we've got sort of like two characters that are butting heads, and they're both kind of flawed. And that ultimately, I think, comes to the core of what this story is about. It's like nobody's really perfect, nobody's really bad. We'll get more into that a little bit later. So, page 32. The scene ends with Carter and the gang riding off into the darkness. John tells Anna that he'll talk to some men in the morning for protection, and the eldest son apologizes, and the Reverend tells him not to be sorry, it wasn't his fault. This really makes me like the Reverend more at this point. This like expressing a guy who's like been shown to be really stern and strict is now showing some compassion to what could have been a really bad situation if he had screwed it up. And I mean, essentially, their lives were in danger. And instead of the Reverend ripping into this kid, he's now kind of saying, hey, don't be sorry. And he actually sort of puts the blame on himself and says, I should have fixed that wooden plank a while ago. Interesting show of compassion. Again, sort of another character choice that makes me like the Reverend a little bit more. So these last two pages were really strange. I kind of imagine them like a scale. On one side is Carter, and the other is John Blood. They started at one point, but now within a few lines, the characters have changed. I don't think they've completely flipped. I still like Carter a little bit more because he hasn't actually done anything bad to this family yet, but that's about to change. So here we go. Scene 8, 10 pages. This is page 33. It's later that night, outside John Blood's house. Everyone is asleep. One of the boys wakes up when he hears a sound. Page 34. The boy gets out of bed and sneaks a peek down the stairs to see a pair of boots entering the house. He wakes up the eldest brother, Daniel. The youngest is named Jackrabbit. Page 35. Levi, Carter's brother, one of the thugs, enters the boy's room and tells the boys not to wake anyone, drawing his gun, essentially holding them hostage. One of the brothers says, but he said you wouldn't be back for 3 days. So this is pretty sneaky. They actually ended up coming back later that night. Okay, page 36. Carter enters the bedroom of Anna and John Blood, and Carter touches John Blood's toe, waking him up. John is startled, of course, because he was sleeping, but he has a gun under the sheets. Page 37. We're back in the brother's room, and a gunshot rings out through the house. One of the kids screams, Mama, and he gets hammered in the face with the butt of Levi's gun, sending the kid to the floor. Levi reassures the kid that it's not likely that Carter shot Anna. Levi calls out to Carter and Billy Roy and asks if Anna shot them instead. This is sort of a really interesting tell that he's worried that Anna has shot them. This will make a little bit more sense in issue 2. Okay, so we're into page 38, and this page is a little confusing, and I'm wondering if that's intentional. Okay, we see Carter coughing. Down feathers float in the air. Billy Roy bursts into the room with his gun drawn. Anna and John Blood are still in bed. John Blood's gun is smoking, and there's a look of surprise on his face. So a shot was fired, but what I'm confused about is what was hit. With all the feathers in the air, I'm assuming he shot the bed or a pillow. Who knows? But what we learn about John Blood in issue 2 makes me think he didn't miss. I don't know. Uh, is it stupid for me to think that he actually shot Carter and those feathers belong to him? Maybe I'm reading into it too much. I mean, is Carter some kind of angel of vengeance? I don't know. Uh, Maybe I am reading into this a little bit too much, but something strange is going on here. As of right now, we're only into. They've only released 2 issues of this comic, so I believe there's a third one coming out soon. And these Distillery comics, they seem to only release 3 issues, and that's it. So we'll see what that actually is. If Carter actually is more than he appears, it's kind of hard to say. Yeah, maybe I'm just reading into it a little bit too much. Who knows? So back into the action. Carter grabs a hold of John Blood and tosses him out of the bed. Page 39. Carter and Billy Roy kick John around, and Anna tells them to stop. She eventually just tells John Blood to let her go and takes her wedding ring off and tosses it on the floor in front of him, saying that she's doing it for his sake. So this is a pretty bold choice. I'm a little conflicted about how I feel about it. So maybe she's not being kidnapped after all. I mean, she is sort of making a sacrifice, saying like she's willing to go with Carter and his gang if, so that they don't kill her husband, right? So she's making that sacrifice. But I guess technically she's still being kidnapped because she's going against her will. But even the act of tossing the ring on the ground and saying she's willing to go just to save his life is kind of cold. Is she really trying to save him? I don't know. Poor John Blood, right? Page 40. Carter leaves the house with Anna, and John Blood says he will never forgive Carter. Carter says, never ain't so long. Page 41. Back in the boys' bedroom, Levi asks why they call one of the brothers Jackrabbit, and it's because of his ears. Then there's a scream off panel. We don't know who it is yet, though. Page 42. The boys bolt, but Levi catches them and pulls them back. One of the kids asks if he's going to kill them. Levi says, if I ever see you again, I will. And for some reason, Levi goes in and bites a chunk out of Jackrabbit's ear and spits it out. Okay, scene 9, last scene of the book, 3 pages long. We're looking at page 43. The next morning, the kids wake up and think that Carter and his gang are gone, but they're scared to look. Page 44, they venture down the stairs and discover their mother's wedding ring. Outside the house, the kids see something off panel. Unseen by them, we also see that Carter has killed their dogs. Now, remember what I said about killing dogs earlier and how that reveals a villain? We'll talk about more about that in a minute. So the narration continues with the middle brother saying it'll be all right. But the narrator continues saying that he's lying and that nothing would be all right ever again. Telling a lie to reassure someone instead of saving his own neck made him feel like an adult. So at this point, I think the narrator is the middle brother, but I'm not exactly sure. Page 45, the last page of issue 1. The boys venture out of the house and across the field to the church to discover that John Blood is hanging from the cross in front of his church. The narration finishes with, "This is my story. The Reverend would be ashamed." I think it's referring to the lying that the narrator has said to the younger brother. So here we go. That's it for issue 1 of The Blood Brothers' Mother. Okay, so let's step back and take a 10,000-foot look at the story and how the scenes map out. Now, so the reason I wanted to talk about this comic as one of the videos is because I thought there was an interesting change that happened here. At the very first, I started reading the comic and was following Carter. I really liked the choices that he made, kind of showing him as a good character, even though he is an outlaw, and following him through that journey up until he meets John Blood and wants to take Anna by any means necessary, essentially kidnapping her. Well, that kind of put a little bit of a damper on his character. And then at the very end, where he kills John Blood, who ends up being kind of a good guy to his stepkids, that makes Carter even worse of a character to me. And at the end of the story, I was really lost. And then I realized something the title of this comic is called The Blood Brothers Mother. And I all of a sudden realized that this is not a story about Carter and his release from prison and his journey. This is actually a story about the Blood Brothers, who are literal blood brothers because they're the kids of John Blood now. I guess the wards of John Blood. So when I got to the end of the book and realized that this is the Blood Brothers story, it became really interesting. So all of a sudden, the very last page where they discover the father has been killed is the inciting incident for the Blood Brothers. And this is the beginning of that story. What we've seen up to the point with Carter, I'm not sure. I think what's going to end up happening is this is going to be a dual protagonist story. We're going to kind of follow Carter's story. Usually when you got an anti-hero like this who's been released from prison, there's sort of like a redemption story arc that's happening. There's another element of him possibly getting shot by John Blood and not even being phased and the feathers flying all over the place. I start to think of like, is this a story about the four horsemen of the apocalypse? Again, probably reading a little bit too much into that, and the last book hasn't come out yet, so I can't really confirm any of this. But just sort of a very interesting and conflicted experience watching this character. And notice how I didn't really point out any points of empathy for Carter. It's not like you ever empathize with his situation. I mean, maybe when he's let free from prison, right? You could empathize with the fact that he's like finally been released, but it's not like he was in prison for something he didn't do. It was for something he did do. Ultimately, I think this story shows a lot of characters who are flawed, and nobody's a purely good guy, and nobody's purely a bad guy. And we're going to kind of see just different shades of gray throughout. Not sure how I feel about that. Not sure. I'll say the Blood Brothers seem to be the most good on the scale that we've seen so far. Although one of them did kill a frog, so I'm not sure about that. And then we have the situation where Carter, who is kind of the anti-hero of for most of the story, him and his gang kill a dog at the end, which kind of reveals them as a villain as well. So it's just sort of a really interesting story arc where you've had sort of a guy established, you're following his journey, you're sort of rooting for him, you're kind of, you like his character choices, and then at the end he kidnaps a woman and kills a dog. How do you feel about that? It's very conflicting. And then there's this idea of a mother leaving her husband to die and leaving the children on their own. I understand this is sort of the Old West, and children were a little bit more grown up back then, had a lot more responsibilities. They're probably already working on the farm or whatever it is. And they were probably left on their own a little bit more. I know in my childhood, I was left riding around the neighborhood on my bike where my parents had no idea where I was. So at the same time, she's really abandoning her kids. And it's a very strange choice for her. I guess she has really great faith that her kids are going to survive, even though the stepfather has been killed. So in the end, I think The Blood Brothers Mother is a really interesting sort of look at the different levels of gray that a character can have in sort of a very sort of corrupt world. Oh, I will say actually in issue 2, there's a lot more revealed about John Blood and sort of his character and the reason why he's a reverend. So that's worth checking out. But ultimately, all these characters have different shades of gray. Nobody's good. Nobody's completely bad. And I don't know how I feel about that. Watching a character kind of go from good to bad, it's not like a great feeling for me as a viewer and or as a reader, and just kind of watching it happen just leaves me conflicted. So ultimately, The Blood Brothers Mother is a very conflicted story that I don't know if you at the end of at the end of the day when this thing wraps up, I'm not sure it's gonna be like all good feelings by the end. So if you like watch reading those stories where you're getting insight into like a character that's a little bit more muddy, a little bit more conflicted, maybe this would be one of those stories where I'm not sure it's going to end with a happy ending. But I do think there is some insight there into when the warden was talking about Carter, not John Carter, but Carter dying in prison. I do think there's going to be possibly a redemption arc for him in the story somehow. But at this point, the fact that he's like abandoned 3 kids and killed a dog and kidnapped a woman, it's like, yeah, I can understand if there's a lot of people who just didn't continue reading this because it's not really a great character you want to sit with for very long. So here we go. We've got our 10,000 foot view of this story, 9 different scenes. We have 2 inciting incidents. Technically, I should have broken this out into two different character threads, but because I think there's going to be a dual protagonist in this story between Carter and the Blood Brothers. But because the Blood Brothers inciting incident happens at the very end of the last page, I just didn't bother to include it for now. Maybe if I had continued doing this series, I would break it up. But yeah, for right now, there really is no like major action besides I guess Carter shooting sort of the thugs at the campfire. So I didn't really highlight anything there. So I want to finish off with saying that even though this story is 45 pages long, it moves very quickly. I'm kind of surprised how fast it is to read through some of the pages. I think, Brian Azzarello is doing a lot of, again, sort of giving very minimal amounts of information. A lot of it's done visually, which is really interesting. And then, I think he's leaving a lot to Eduardo Rizzo, who's an artist he's worked with for a very long time, so he has a lot of trust with. Ultimately, The Blood Brothers' Mother is going to be one of those stories that's going to kind of make you feel like, I'm betting you're going to need to take a shower after reading this whole series. So if you're into that kind of story, definitely check that out. I'm going to continue reading and see what happens in the third one because I still have questions. All right, that's it for this episode of The Story Grind. Please like, follow, subscribe, and share this with your writing friends. And let's build a community in here. Please leave your comments below